Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin, bringing you stories of capitalism. This week, as President Trump takes drastic action to curtail federal spending, Ray Dalio of Bridgewater lays out his plan for what needs to be done. Plus, Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla announces earnings that include his huge investment in tackling cancer. But we start with a story about lost opportunity. The opportunity to make real progress fighting one of the most devastating diseases we know, Alzheimer's, with questions now being raised about much of the work that's gone into finding a cure.
Alzheimer's disease affects millions and millions of Americans, but not just millions and millions of individual patients, but also orders of magnitude larger than that because of the effects on their families and their effects on larger society. This is a massive problem.
Nearly 7 million Americans over 65, about 1 in 9, suffer from Alzheimer's. Costs of care are soaring, $360 billion in 2024, projected to hit $1 trillion by 2050, $400,000 per person, with 70% borne by the family. The race for a cure is on, but not without its setbacks, as Vanderbilt neurologist Matthew Schrag explains.
So in recent years, we've had some candidates for treatment come up, even been approved by the FDA and been sold, ultimately, although with some controversy.
This family of drugs that we're talking about are a group of antibodies, and antibodies are a molecule that your body produces naturally. These ones are synthetic ones that have been engineered, and they're designed to bind up a little tiny protein called beta amyloid, and we think that it's poisonous to the brain, and that's thought to be the fundamental driver of Alzheimer's disease. The antibodies administered to patients bind up to that beta amyloid and help to remove it from the brain. And the idea is hopefully that will interfere with the progression of Alzheimer's disease.
Hopefully it will. But in fact, there have been some treatments that appear to make some progress on the science, but don't have clinical results.
Well, so fundamentally, what patients care about is the beta amyloid removed from the brain, right? Patients are concerned about, can they think clearly? Can they remember things? And these drugs didn't robustly show an effect. You had a reasonably good biochemical outcome, but that really didn't help people.
The problem, I think, that we've seen over 30 years of study of the amyloid hypothesis and the development of dozens of anti-amyloid drugs and vaccines is that it hasn't panned out.
Charles Piller is an investigative reporter for Science magazine.
Many neurologists and other doctors whose patients have asked about these drugs have the opinion that this statistical effect is not really a clinical effect. In other words, the impact is so subtle as to be imperceptible to patients or their families. However, these drugs also come with great risks, including the risk of death or brain damage associated with brain swelling or bleeding that they can cause.
Biogen received FDA approval for the first anti-amyloid drug in 2021, leading to hope for Alzheimer's patients. This and other similar approvals, Piller says, ignited a market frenzy, but Schrag calls it a dead end, a view echoed in Piller's new book, Doctored: Fraud, Arrogance, and Tragedy in the Quest to Cure Alzheimer's.
There's been a fair amount of research, work, money being put into it. Why is it that we haven't made more progress?
The simplest answer is that it's a complicated disease. I've become more concerned as time has gone on that research integrity may be part of that equation.
After Schrag criticized the FDA's approval of the Biogen drug, two physicians skeptical of another Alzheimer's treatment, this one from Cassava, hired him to do an independent investigation. Cassava's stock had soared 900%, leading to a $5.4 billion valuation, and the physicians ended up shorting the stock and filing a whistleblower complaint with the SEC.
A number of individuals were concerned that something fishy might be going on and started to examine the basic science and some of the other supporting information around this drug and started to develop concerns. And their attorney reached out to me to be part of the process to evaluate the science behind this drug, Simufilm, and Cassava Sciences.
What did you find when you started looking into it?
So, a lot of the basic science that supported the use of this drug came from a single laboratory, a laboratory run by a gentleman named Hao-Yang Wang at City University of New York. And when we looked at his work, we found an extended pattern of alterations in the data coming out of this laboratory. A lot of the data, a lot of these sorts of experiments, often the output is an image. And sometimes you can see when you look at an image things that make you think it's been altered. It's just in the same way you could walk through a magazine aisle and look at a photo and say maybe that's been touched up. Something strikes you as something unnatural about that image. And so when we went through his work, we found lots of that sort of problems.
But just getting it wrong is something different. That can happen to any scientist.
We all get it wrong. Absolutely. This is not about making mistakes. We're looking at a very coherent pattern of altering data to fit certain hypotheses. When you collect your data, right, there should be very little reason to make cut and paste type changes within an image. You know, I think there are things that you can see that are universally inappropriate.
Schrag's findings supported a citizens' petition urging the FDA to halt clinical trials.
I was tagged on Twitter in a post where somebody said, "Hey, Elizabeth, you need to look at this." And it was a link to a citizen petition.
Dutch microbiologist Elizabeth Bick is a forensic image expert and pioneer of crowdsourcing to uncover flawed studies. Using such platforms as PubPeer, she and other sleuths publicly share evidence of apparent data manipulation.
These were photos of these scientific papers that looked at Western blots, which are protein blots, and it showed all kinds of problems in these scientific papers. And it looked like a lot of that body of work contained potential fraudulent results. And so I completely agree that it would make sense to ask the FDA to halt the trials on humans. Because if the work done on animals already looks fraudulent, it's very unlikely that it would work.
Do you know what ultimately happened to cassava and its medication?
There have been a number of investigations. The Department of Justice appears to have pursued a case against Hao-Yang Wang. He was actually arrested for this type of data manipulation, accusations of data manipulation and fraud. And so I know that case is proceeding.
The stock plummeted 85% in a matter of basically minutes when it was announced that the drug had failed. And so what happened is a lot of people in the market lost money on this drug, enormous amounts of money. The question I have is why the FDA, which is the agency that had the power to intervene, didn't do anything for literally years, knowing what they knew.
Cassava says it is cooperating with the DOJ and has made changes to the leadership team. Wang pleaded not guilty, but what Pillar and Schrag had found led them to look beyond cassava, enlisting a team of private citizens, including Bick, to investigate whether there might be other problems with Alzheimer's research. They say they uncovered numerous instances of data manipulation going all the way back to one particularly influential paper published nearly 20 years ago.
We were both kind of stunned when we together discussed this experiment by Karen Ash and Sylvain Lesnay that was so instrumental to the field and yet seemed to be very suspect.
Ash and Lesnay's 2006 Nature publication shaped the field's understanding of Alzheimer's.
The amyloid cascade hypothesis took a bit of a stumble in the early 2000s. And this group of investigators, Karen Ash and Sylvain Lesnay, were one of those who came in and said, aha, we think we've identified the silver bullet.
And so what you had is, for the first time, ostensibly an experiment that showed a kind of cause and effect, direct cause and effect of a substance that seemed to be causing Alzheimer's disease. And lo and behold, it was an an amyloid beta protein.
And it sort of rescued the amyloid hypothesis. It was cited thousands and thousands of times, and variations of this theme were developed. But what we found in the course of doing this research integrity work, I bumped into a number of papers from Sylvain Lesny, the first author, and we found that there seemed to be artifactual changes in his work as well, including in this famous Nature paper. And as we analyzed that paper, we found that the majority of the figures seemed to have evidence of tampering in them.
And I understand Dr. Ash actually has withdrawn the paper now.
She has. It was retracted in the last 6 months or so.
The University of Minnesota conducted an investigation and found no research misconduct, but the authors, with the exception of Lesny, agreed to retract the paper, and Ash took responsibility, though she said she had no knowledge of any image manipulations until it was brought to my attention. She continues to back the amyloid hypothesis and her conclusions. Lesny has not commented and remains in good standing with the NIH. According to Ash, Lesny denies fabricating the data.
How did NIH react?
What I can tell you is that we saw very slow progress in dealing with these things. We saw Sylvain Lesny continue to get funding, even new funding, after these reports came out and were widely accepted that these were serious problems. And initially you wonder, how could that be? Until you take a larger look at the field and you realize that the leadership of the NIH has not been completely immune to these types of problems.
The administrator overseeing Lesny's NIH grant co-authored the now retracted Nature paper. The team also found issues with the work of the man who led the division at the NIH National Institute on Aging.
A gentleman named Eliezer Maslia, who was the neuroscience director at the NIA. And this was probably one of the most prolific cases of apparently doctored data that I'd ever seen. We stopped analyzing when we got to something like 130 papers and just said, that's enough. We can't spend the rest of our lives looking at this. But this is somebody who has been able to ascend to the very highest echelons at the NIH.
The day Pillar's report in Science was published, Maslia was removed from his post.
So it appears that there is a broader problem than you first understood. I wonder what thoughts you have about where it comes from.
Science is a human endeavor, right? Scientists are people. The Garden of Eden happened to all of us, right? We are all flawed people, and scientists are going to be subject to the same temptations as everybody else. And so I think part of what needs to happen as a discipline is that we need to be a little bit less naive.
What advice do you have for an investor, given what you've said about some of the problems with science? It really is quite unsettling if we think the science we think we know, we don't know.
If you're going to make an investment of not only millions or tens of millions or sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars in clinical trials, but also ask hundreds or thousands of patients to accept the risk of exposing themselves to experimental drugs, we should start with, do we think we're starting from a trustworthy foundation? That's a fair question, and it should be asked consistently. And I think that sometimes it's time to ask the field to move on, right? I think that even a non-scientist can listen to Alzheimer's research over the last 30 years and say, I've been hearing amyloid and amyloid and amyloid, but what's not changing is what's happening for our family members, right? And that it's time for something else. Before we do this again, tell me why it's going to be different this time. And I think that the investors can motivate change.
Coming up, when Pfizer announced its earnings, many were focused on its huge commitment to finding a cure for another dreaded disease, the disease of cancer. We hear from Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla about his plans to do for cancer what Pfizer did for COVID. That's next on Wall Street Week. This is a story about hope. Hope for those who need it desperately when they learn they have that disease all of us dread, the diagnosis of cancer.
The surgery was successful. However, tests after the operation found cancer had been present.
I know a little bit more. People who've been told they have cancer know a little bit more than other people. That's staring you right in the face, and it may actually happen.
In 2024, the United States hit a new milestone, estimated to pass 2 million newly diagnosed cases of cancer.
One, it is that the cancer incidence is increasing. Right now we have 15 million approximately in the world, people that are suffering from cancer every year. Probably the number will go to 30 plus in 2050. And that is happening because, first of all, people live longer lives, and that the age favors, unfortunately, cancer. But also there are risk factors, and we have better ways of detecting now cancer. So that's one.
They're living longer, but actually we're seeing more incidents, are we not, in younger people, which is surprising.
We are, and this is kind of emerging right now. And there are risk factors, starting from environment, starting from multiple alcohol, smoking, but also it is the fact that we can detect cancers way more efficiently today than we could do it years back.
Dr. Albert Bourla is the chairman and CEO of Pfizer. Under his leadership, the pharmaceutical company partnered with BioNTech during the COVID-19 pandemic to roll out life-saving mRNA vaccines.
How to operate with speed. The vaccine, or the operational warp speed that President Trump actually had initiated, was an operation that removed obstacles, but also within the companies was an operation that we were shooting for the impossible. And we came with a mindset, nothing is impossible. We can make it possible. That's a mindset that we can use again, not to find a solution for COVID, but to find a solution for cancer or for Alzheimer.
Cancer is Dr. Bourla's next big challenge at Pfizer. In 2023, Pfizer completed its $43 billion acquisition of Seagen, a company basing a particular cancer treatment on monoclonal antibodies. Just this week, Pfizer reported earnings that included an increase in spending on oncology to about 25% of its revenue.
You have made cancer a real priority for Pfizer in your investments, in your R&D, in your development, even your acquisitions. Why?
Because we think that we are ready to provide a solution. We want to save the world again. And I think our best chance this time, it is with cancer. The science is there. We invest probably double than all the profits that we made with COVID to acquire a new technology, which is promising a lot.
The number of U.S. cancer cases may be going up, but the mortality rate is actually going down. It's fallen 34% in the last 30 years. And the National Institutes of Health project that, if this trend continues, the United States will have 26 million cancer survivors by 2040, a 44% increase over 2022. Pfizer hopes to keep this trend going through one particular oncology treatment turbocharged by its acquisition of Seagen.
It's called antibody-drug conjugate, or ADC technology. And this is like a missile that it is GPS guided. So it doesn't go anywhere in the body. It's going straight to the target, which is the cancer cell. And what is on top of this missile? A warhead, which we call payload, a chemotherapy that is going to be targeting those cells. We know that some cancer cells express some proteins. Then we create an antibody that it is attracted by these proteins. The antibody is the GPS system. Then we have a payload, which is the warhead. It can be chemical or nuclear or tactical, depends on what you want to attack. And then you need to link the two together, and that is called the conjugation. That means that we believe that in the next 10 years, most of the general chemotherapies could be replaced with targeted therapies like that. They have way less side effects because the chemotherapy attacks also the healthy cells. Right now, we can minimize the impact on the healthy cells and maximize the impact on the cancerous cells.
How far along are we in the process with this new technology of really having something that will start curing people?
I think already we start having dramatic results that, for example, they can triple the life expectancy of the current standards of care. But I don't think it will be a miracle that will come from one day to another. It will be, though, constant improvement every quarter. We will have, not only us, but others as well, releases of new data, of new medicines. Eventually, some of these cancers will be cured, which means that they will disappear and will not come back again. But many of them will become chronic disease. You can learn to live with your cancer with medicines that are not affecting the quality of your life.
Pfizer is not alone in looking for ways to make cancer more manageable. Research has a key ally in artificial intelligence.
I think it allows several things. First is it makes diagnosis and treatment planning more accurate. You know, we're moving away from one size fits all in terms of treatment of cancer or many other conditions. We know that each of us has different manifestations of the way a tumor is going to grow or spread, and also how it's going to respond to treatment. And we need to be able to bring the best treatment to each patient at that particular moment in time, and AI is enabling us to do that.
Dr. Lloyd Minor is the dean of the Stanford University School of Medicine, where he has pushed the institution to focus on precision health, intended to tailor care to patients' individual needs.
I think really we're finding things otherwise we would have not found, because the human brain can only store so much information, and traditional analytic methods have their limitations. Generative AI is bringing out relationships that we would have perhaps never been able to garner without the advent of foundation models and their application to the interpretation of medical data. I think the deployment of generative AI, the pace of that deployment and its impact is greater and faster than the pace of any technological innovation that I've seen in my life. And I think we're still at the relatively early stages.
DeepMind's AlphaFold is proof of how much AI can do in the medical field. It uses its vast computational power trained by 170,000 proteins to predict protein structures.
I remember when I was starting in college, I joined this lab and we were crystallizing proteins and putting the coordinates of their atoms into a database along with many others. And I remember Professor Steve Harrison, who was the leader of our lab, telling us it might take 50 years before we're able to predict how a protein folds given its amino acid sequence.
Marty Chavez has been a fixture on Wall Street since 1993 when he joined Goldman Sachs. But his biochemistry roots go back to his undergraduate days at Harvard University. Today, he serves as a board member of Alphabet, whose subsidiary, DeepMind, won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for AlphaFold last year.
They gave it the 50,000 amino acid sequences or proteins that had been sequenced, and the structure was known through crystallography. They trained the neural network on that database, the protein data bank, and then they did something kind of amazing, which is they then guessed 75,000 protein sequences for which the structure was not known. So here's the amino acid sequence, guess the structure. They fed those guesses back into the model, and then, I'm oversimplifying of course, but now the model seems to predict with uncanny accuracy the shape in space of proteins that have never been crystallized. It seems that the model discovered some deep patterns in the way proteins fold in space and somehow compressed and captured that knowledge into the model.
We hear a lot about generative AI, and there were just a Nobel Prize given out for the AlphaFold technology. What does that mean, if anything, for cancer? How does those two fit together?
Well, it's, I believe, not only for cancer, but also for cancer. It's going to propel the biological research, AI, in unprecedented ways. We are going to shorten the time that we need to be able to develop molecules.
What's the time horizon, as far as you understand it, for generative AI really making a big difference?
I think quick. I think already we are deploying it, so it made very big difference in the example that I gave you. But as we are deploying in different aspects of the process from discovery to development, I think with the next 2-3 years, we'll have phenomenal results.
Bourla points out that Pfizer is investing twice what it made off of COVID treatments to address the scourge of cancer, and it will need to replicate some version of that COVID success in redirecting its efforts. After its stock price surged from that success, shares are down nearly 50% since December 2021, leading activist investor Starboard to take a $1 billion stake in Pfizer, turning up pressure on the company to prove the value of its Seagen acquisition and investment in its drug line.
I know that you're committed to this fight against cancer, as is Pfizer, to save lives, first and foremost. But it's also a business. How big a business opportunity is it potentially if you really have breakthroughs?
It is a very big business opportunity. I'll tell you something. There is a myth about the pharmaceutical business model. And the myth says that whatever is good for patients and whatever is good for shareholders is fundamentally at odds. In fact, the reverse is true. You can't make any money. Actually, you're going to lose all your money in this business unless you are able to discover very meaningful, not me too solutions, very meaningful solutions for the patients. So if we discover medicines that really double and triple the survival, then it's very good business. If we fail, because we take a lot of risk, it's not good business.
You always have new drugs in the pipeline. Where are you on cancer drugs in the pipeline right now at Pfizer?
It is the crown jewel. We are having most of our pipeline drugs, and the most important are coming from cancer. Of course, we have vaccines, we have internal medicines, we have work in obesity, we have work in arthritis and immunoinflammation, but cancer is where we have most of them. And I would say that 3 of the most prominent candidates are entering or have entered or are about to enter phase 3 studies.
For Dr. Bourla, the mission to make life more livable with cancer is worthwhile because it is a disease that affects us all, no matter where we come from or who we are.
It is a global problem and affects all of us. Maybe not all of us as patients, thankfully, but all of us as sons and daughters, as fathers and mothers, unfortunately, as friends, as neighbors. So cancer is something that is scaring people right now. And it is not only in the US or in Europe or in the most advanced economically countries.
Coming up, President Trump says he wants to get federal spending down. Bridgewater founder Ray Dalio gives us his diagnosis for what could turn into a debt crisis and what the president and Congress need to do to avoid it. This is a story about going broke. Whether you're a person, a company, or an entire nation, it all comes down to the same thing: not being able to pay your debts as they come due.
The U.S. federal government's fiscal policy is on an unsustainable path. The level of our debt relative to the economy is not unsustainable. The path is unsustainable.
The United States has been running up a large tab for years now, going from a debt of $5.7 trillion in 2000 to over $35 trillion in 2024. And so far, it doesn't show any signs of slowing down, with the Congressional Budget Office projecting that, at the rate it's going, the U.S. will owe over $50 trillion by 2035, or about 118% of its annual GDP.
The debt ceiling was...
The Trump administration comes to office aware of the challenge posed by the federal debt and is taking steps it says will help address the problem. Bridgewater founder Ray Dalio has written a new book, available at no charge online, addressing the U.S. debt problem. It's called How Countries Go Broke. And he starts with how much the U.S. is going to have to borrow and who will lend it the money it needs.
The difference is they can print money. And then that's basically it. So what you have is a situation where there's a supply and a demand for debt. As we have a new supply, that will equal in the United States now, by the way, this is a problem elsewhere too, but it's about 7.5% of GDP. So the supply of debt is going to be large. That's new debt. If I calculate also who are the buyers of that debt, and that there's not going to be enough demand for that debt. It doesn't look like there'll be enough demand. And the way that it works, so there's two things to keep in mind. There's supply and demand, and then what do central banks do, or what do the governments do when they don't have enough demand? Central banks come in and make up that demand. They essentially print money, and then they buy that. And then that has a consequence. And so just like in 2020, 21, we went through, they needed to give money away, and the government needed to borrow, and the central bank produced the money and bought that. That devalues money, raises inflation, and so on.
Thus far, the United States has been able to support ever-growing debt and deficits because of that ability to print money. But Dalio warns that, throughout history, countries have run up against the demand of creditors sooner or later to get paid.
It is when the owners of that debt, we have, over $36 trillion essentially of government debt, when they start to also fear that it may be monetized, like the Japanese. Japanese is a very good example. Japanese, if you have terrible investment to own bonds, they didn't go down in value, but you got an interest rate that was 3% below another interest rate, U.S. interest rate by way of example, and the currency depreciated by 3.5%. They were losing 6.5% a year for many, many years. That's what it can be like. Of course, there's an inflation component that enters into the depreciation. One of the things I also want to emphasize is people pay too much attention to depreciation against another exchange rate. Normally at such times, many countries have this issue, and they don't want their currency to depreciate. So what you see is the depreciation of all currencies in relationship to things like gold or other assets, and that's where you have to pay attention to it.
So if there is a debt wall out there somewhere that we will run into, how close are we to it? And how can we tell? As with our personal finances, Dalio says it's when we end up borrowing not to invest in our future, but to pay the interest on what we've already borrowed.
Debt isn't a problem if the debt is used to produce an income that is large enough or larger than enough to service the debt. It's like a company, if you were like your finances. But what happens is it accumulates, tends to accumulate. Think of it like a disease that has a progression, and it goes through these various stages. And so you can kind of see where the stages are. We're relatively late in the cycle because we're also having central banks lose money. That's a marker. When their balance sheet deteriorates, when they have a negative net worth. For example, in the UK, can the central bank have a negative net worth? According to their laws, the central government has got to recapitalize the bank. That becomes a budget item. So there are certain red flags. There are a bunch in this study that I've put out so that you could see them. Debt service payments, borrowing to borrow. So we are in the later stages of this. This is something that will be, I think, the most important issue that we'll be talking about. We're not talking about it now, but we will be talking about it over the next few months because the budget is the issue.
Dalio sees signs in the market that now point toward the end of the cycle.
What happens is that you see interest rates rise, led by the long end, when there's an easing of monetary policy and the currency depreciating. Well, you think, wait, isn't the Fed lowering interest rates? Isn't the Bank of England lowering interest rates? Why are long-term interest rates going up? Okay, they're not intervening. Well, there must be something with the supply-demand of those bonds because it's not their transactions that are driving those interest rates up. And the currency is falling at the same time. Okay, that is reflecting leaving, in other words, selling the bonds and leaving that instrument. So when you have that dynamic, it's a red flag. So we're having elements of that dynamic. So not only is the supply-demand operating that way, but the market action is operating that way.
If Dalio is right, if the United States is approaching the end of what he calls the long debt cycle, what should it do to make sure it doesn't hit that wall?
There are three factors that drive the budget deficit. Spending, cut spending, it'll be reduced. Taxes, raise taxes, not tax rates, but taxes. Sometimes you can cut tax rates and get that more tax revenue. So I just want to say taxes, tax revenue. But interest, if the government was operating as a unit with the central bank and there was a coordination, if there was a fiscal tightening coordinated with monetary easing, both of those things reduce the problem. And so an action of getting it at 3% of GDP, if I scream out a number, the 3% solution, I think that the policymakers have to start from the top and say 3% of GDP. We can do this. We will do this in one way or another. They can't let their pet programs, I think they don't have that mantra. They don't have what is the amount, and then they have to agree, at least if we can't agree, what do we do? Do it proportionately. Whatever you do, you must do this. Because if you don't, you are risking what I would call, this heart attack due to that constriction of debt service payments and or a piece of that plaque breaking off sort of the sale of those bonds. You're risking that needlessly. And so many things are so beautiful, you don't need to do that.
In the end, Dalio's How Countries Go Broke isn't simply a jeremiad. It does warn of some pretty dire consequences if we don't act, and don't act soon. But he also sees a path forward toward what he calls a beautiful deleveraging.
A beautiful deleveraging, one way or another, is there's ways of reducing your debt and debt burdens, some of which are deflationary and some of which are inflationary. And if you balance those, you will reduce it in a balanced way. That's what I mean by beautiful deleveraging. So for example, fiscal spending cuts or tightening, raising taxes, will reduce the debt burden, but it's a deflationary influence. There's interest rates, and reducing interest rates is a stimulative way because it reduces debt service payments directly for the government, so they have a lower debt bill. And it also is stimulative to the economy at the same time, which can raise tax revenues and also raise asset prices. If we think beyond what our usual constraints are about dealing with the budget, in other words, don't just think about spending and taxes as vehicles, but also think about interest rates and the interest rate component. That could be a balance dealing with that reduction that can accomplish the goal without being depressing and gets it on a better fiscal track.
That does it for us here at Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. This is Bloomberg. See you next week for more stories of capitalism.